The Netflix keeper test. Big and scary. And many of you probably heard about it in the news, read about it in an article, Glassdoor, or something like that. Well, I was a director at Netflix and there for almost 9 years. And today I want to talk about the keeper test and debunk it and talk about how it should be used and how I used it while I was there. Hey all, it's Rico, and today I'm going to reveal my truth about the Netflix keeper test. It's been one of the most celebrated and frustrating culture tools. It's also been super ambiguous. I've heard non-Netflix employees who've never been employed there talk about them in extremes, like in articles and things like that. I've also heard ex-Netflixers talk about like the reason why they were let go was because of the keeper test. And I've even had to address the keeper test policy and culture in high-ranking leadership interviews that I've had to do. Today, I want to talk more about it and demystify the keeper test a little bit. So the points I want to hit on is 1, define what it is. 2, context on why it exists. 3, how I used it and teams around me in my upline and downline used it. And then potential misuses of the concept. And I think that's going to help clarify where some of the big and scary stories come from. So let's jump right in. What is the keeper test? Well, let's read it straight from Netflix.com. If a member was leaving for a similar role at another company, would the manager try to keep them? Not that scary a statement as it sits if you just read it that way, but what it implies and also learning about some of the context around it can help clarify what this policy actually means. So to truly dive into how to interpret this, I'm going to give you a little bit more context. So more context on why it exists. Netflix values the dream team over the family concept. And how it differs is families are unconditional. You never abandon your family. Your family is forever. So that's what makes it unconditional. But a dream team is much different. And Netflix values that team concept. So when you're building an all-star team, you get the best players for every position that you have. And you can respect, love, and have that connection with each other. But unlike the family, if someone doesn't perform well, you're sad, but you find someone who can perform that role, that job, that position at a higher level. So to keep that dream team concept intact. Now, this is where people get upset and the animosity comes from. But the thing I want to clarify here is how it gets deployed and used. I want to be clear about how I use the concept and I interpreted the concept and how that was different, how some others, even within Netflix, used the concept and even potentially weaponized it in a negative way. And that might just be for another video. So how I use the keeper test. Now, I didn't wake up every morning, and look at over 135 people and say, who am I going to keep today? That would be toxic and that would just create a culture of fear. Many of you probably heard that used with Netflix. We'll get into that later. The way I and my leadership team interpreted the keeper test usually was when we were looking at reorganizing the team, if the scope of the team or for a person has shifted, or if someone was even underperforming and not responding to feedback. So already you can start to understand how these are specific and intentional uses for the keeper test. It was never, hey, it's Tuesday, time to run the keeper test. That's not how it was. Unfortunately though, because other managers at Netflix didn't communicate this to their teams and never addressed the finer cultural points of the Netflix culture about high performance, keeper tests, and things like that, there was a mixed interpretation of how the keeper test should be used and how it applies to everybody. And that's how this idea of like the keeper test at any time perpetuated, which is not good for team culture or team morale. I was very clear whenever I had onboarding with new team members, how keeper test was deployed, context not control, like addressing really all the finer points of the Netflix culture and explaining how it shows up. So my team was clear about when the keeper test would be deployed or not. And I was always transparent about when these things would happen. If there was a reorg coming down, if the scope of work is changing, if somebody needed feedback and wasn't meeting the needs or meeting the requirements of the role, it was never a surprise. And that's how I treated transparency. So a little bit about how I use it. So if I was in the middle of a reorg or scope shifting, or if somebody wasn't responding to feedback, I would actually shift the question slightly. I'd ask myself, knowing what I know now and knowing what I need in the future, would I hire this person again to build this team? In some cases, it was yes, but in other cases, it was no. But in shifting the question slightly, it helped me understand what I would need for the next hire, but it would also give me an idea of what to do with this person. Now, I could let them go, which, it happened, rarely happened, but I did have to let people go, or I'd have a better idea of how to better utilize their skill set in the new org design. Now, don't get me wrong. Like I said, I did have to exit people for underperformance and because of the keeper test, but the common theme with those folks is they weren't surprised. I've actually been told in an exit conversation that I'm not surprised, or it's about time, or I knew it was coming. So that's the thing about the keeper test. It shouldn't be just used for no reason or as a surprise. And that's, getting into the potential misuse of the concept. I won't say that there weren't bad actors out there that let people go because they didn't like them, or maybe they didn't agree with their perspective. And they did that under the guise of the keeper test, which is not useful or helpful. But that's what led to the company feeling that the keeper test was evil. But what I would say is, just like anything, it's more the user of the tool than the tool itself. A tool itself isn't harmful, but if it's used incorrectly or deployed in a not great way, that becomes more dangerous. This misuse of the keeper test is what caused that culture of fear that people hear about and perpetuate about Netflix, which I never experienced because I didn't have this keeper test concept hanging over my head all the time. Unfortunately, though, for some subsets of teams, like this was a reality. The keeper test was hung over their heads and was dangled as like, hey, you need to do better. But again, it was not my organization, not the organization I reported up to. My organization was great about taking the right steps, being transparent and talking through the keeper test and using it sparingly and intentionally when it needed to be used. So hopefully I've given you a bit more context and insight on how the keeper test is actually a good tool for understanding your team and your organization and keeping that all-star team concept, but also how it can be misused. And if it's not clear about how and when it is used, it can actually cause swirl and a culture of fear. I really like the concept. I really like the tool. If you have more questions or comments, drop them down below. And as always, I will see you next time.